am Dr. Peter Malinowski, clinical psychologist, trauma therapist, podcaster, blogger, co-founder and president of Souls and Hearts at soulsandhearts.com. But most of all, first and foremost, I am a passionate Catholic. And I also happen to be your host and guide in this Interior Integration for Catholics podcast. It is an honor. It is a pleasure to be with all of you. And why do we do this podcast? Why do we do this podcast? Because I want you to be able to taste and see the height and depth and breadth and warmth and the light of the love of God, especially God, your Father, and Mary, your mother. Our spiritual parents are primary parents. I am here to help you embrace your identity as a beloved little child, a beloved little son or daughter of God and Mary. That is what this podcast is all about. And we do that on this podcast and in Souls and Hearts by shoring up the natural human foundation for the spiritual life. We know from St. Thomas Aquinas that grace perfects nature. And we are all about offering you the best resources for your human formation, grounded in an authentic Catholic understanding of the human person. We look at the obstacles, we look at the hindrances in our human formation. And St. John Paul II, in his 1992 apostolic exhortation, Pastores Dabo Vobis, stated that all formation is based on human formation. All our formation, spiritual formation, intellectual formation, pastoral formation, all formation is based on human formation. And to bring that about, to live out our mission, I bring you new ways of understanding yourself, fresh conceptualizations, informed by the best of human formation resources and psychology, firmly grounded in the perennial teachings of the Catholic Church. And I am so glad that you are with me on this mission to much more deeply understand, quote, borderline, unquote, personality dynamics from a fresh perspective. And today, I offer you episode 126 of this IIC podcast titled Borderline Personalities, Your Questions Answered by Dr. Greg Bottaro. We are recording live with our audience on November 13th, 2023, and the recording of this episode is released on all the podcast platforms on Monday, November 20th, 2023. Now, I got to tell you about this Catholic psychologist named Greg Bottaro, who I am so pleased to have with me as a guest on this episode. Dr. Greg is the founder and executive director of the CatholicPsych Institute. He's one of the real pioneers in bringing the best of psychology to human formation and to bringing human formation to realms outside of just psychotherapy and counseling. And I've long held that psychotherapy and counseling do not hold a monopoly on human formation. Human formation existed long before therapy and counseling existed, and there are so many resources we can tap into in our Catholic tradition to help with that. Dr. Greg has been a pioneer in human formation work for the Catholic Church. He graduated many years ago from the Institute for Psychological Sciences, now known as Divine Mercy University, with his doctorate in psychology. I met him about a decade ago through the Catholic Psychotherapy Association. We've been in touch ever since. He is the host of the Being Human podcast, where he shares with his listeners his pioneering approach to becoming fully human, wholly human. Check that out on all the major podcast platforms. It's in the top 1% of podcasts worldwide with more than 150 episodes. It comes out weekly, and he was gracious enough to have me on in episodes 35 and 36. And so glad that you, Dr. Greg, can be here on mine. He's authored a number of books. He's best known for The Mindful Catholic, Finding God One Moment at a Time. And he also runs some communities like the Integrated Life Community out of the CatholicPsych Institute. And we're going to hear more about Dr. Greg's adventures and his endeavors at the end of this podcast. We'll have an opportunity to talk about them then. But I just want to let you know that I am so excited to have you on today. And I sort of had you on, kind of had you on in episode 122 of this podcast titled "Narcissism and Gaslighting: What Catholics Should Know." You gave me permission to use some quotes from one of your podcast episodes, right? And but it is so much better to have you on live and actually in person. So welcome, Dr. Greg.
Oh, thank you. That is so gracious. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm really so excited to be here with you. This is really amazing. And so many things that you pointed out. I just feel like there's so much mutual work here and admiration and camaraderie and this is just an awesome mission field to be partnering with you in. And so it's really my pleasure to be here with you.
We really do work in the same little neglected, I would say, corner of the vineyard of the church, right? This whole human formation area, which really got launched only 31 years ago, roughly, with Pope John Paul II, with his apostolic exhortation, human formation really being emphasized for the first time. And I think it's just so important. So yeah, I do see as a kindred spirit here in this little corner of the vineyard.
Yeah, it's true. And it's really neglected. So, anytime I hear, or see a phrase that you use or hear something that you put out there, it resonates so deeply. And all I can think is, thank God there's another one. There's another brother out there. Somebody else saying things that are, yeah, it's like, it could get pretty lonely here in this little neglected corner. It's nice to
Absolutely.
feel like you're not going crazy as the only person thinking some of these things.
Well, I was super excited. I said this in episode 122 of this podcast. When I was out looking for understanding gaslighting, and so I was doing an internet search. I went through all of my IFS sources, internal family system sources, because I really wanted to understand from an IFS perspective. Here you are, not only breaking ground within the Catholic world, but really the best resource out there in all of the sort of parts and systems world, the internal family systems world. So I was like, yeah, Greg, like that's just awesome. So
Oh, that's
super
so cool.
excited. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love hearing that. It's, but it really is, isn't it the validation of just knowing that we have the secret? It's like we already know the blueprint of the human person. So
We
it's
get to cheat. We
almost too
really get to
easy.
cheat, don't we? Kind of
We
like compared
do.
to everybody else.
It's cheating.
Yep.
I
Yep.
feel like that all the time. It's really an unfair advantage, but it's not even really the same fight. It's not a fair fight to start with, and we're battling a very different battle in the first place. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. So a couple of things. It is so good to have our live audience with us, right? This is again episode 126, and we are going to be opening this up. First, Dr. Greg and I are going to talk for about 15 or 20 minutes just to really be able to tap his expertise and to take in what he wants to share with us about this quote borderline end quote dynamics. What is the most important takeaway? So we're gonna cover that, and then we're gonna open this up for questions and answers. Now, remember, we don't provide any clinical services in Souls and Hearts. We don't provide any therapy or counseling or assessment or diagnostics or anything like that on a podcast. It's really not possible. But we can discuss our experiences. We can share experiences. We can ask questions. We can dive into things more deeply. There's so much we can do to help with our own human formation in this form that doesn't involve clinical services. All right, Dr. Greg. Well, I'm going to just start off with a big question here, if that's okay,
sure.
and just ask you, what is the most important thing? If there was one most important thing that you want us to know about borderline personality dynamics, what is that one thing?
I think the one thing is that every person, including people with borderline personality disorder, whatever that is, are made in the image of God. And it's an experience in relationship with people that can really test the limits of how much we believe that. And it really tests our faith, and it really tests our own emotional stability and our own emotional regulation, our own sort of sense of self. And it will hold true, as it always does for every single human person, that every person is made in the image of God. And when we really look, we will find under the surface of every distress, every emotional symptom, every personality pattern, somehow there is the core of goodness that we believe in as Catholics, in our Catholic anthropology made in the image of God. We are not dung piles covered over with snow. and we are not fundamentally and fatally flawed, but we are, as you said, grace is perfecting our nature. We have something good to start with in very deep need of grace. And so we can look and we can see. If we look, we will find where the goodness is. And I find that in our culture, in our world, and especially secular psychology, it becomes very easy to forget that with a lot of pejorative kind of descriptions and diagnoses and diagnostic criteria and models. So that I think that's the most important. If you were pushing me to really boil it down to the one most important thing, that's where I'm going to land.
We're made in the image and likeness of God. And I would just tack on to that a diagnostic label, and there's lots of issues with diagnostic labels, but that does not strip us of us being beloved little sons and daughters of God.
Amen.
You know, that is also our identity. And even though it can be really tough to see it in our own selves sometimes, or it can be tough to see it in people that we're close to, that we live with, or that we're in relationship with, that to tack on to that, being made in the image and likeness of God, but also this idea that we're beloved little sons and daughters of God.
Amen. And then, sort of a derivative of that, or the second step of that is that, we are all flawed at the level of concupiscence. and we just take different forms.
Mm-hmm.
And, you bring up being, little sons and daughters. And every time I hear you say that, I think of Saint Therese, one of my favorites. And, one of the most profound, mystical, heroic, saintly, doctorish kinds of insights that she had was that we are all in this together in the same boat. When she was praying for the convict who was to be hung for murder, and she wrote about how she would be sitting at the same table as him in heaven, and she knew that she would get him in there and she would be there, and they were deserving of sitting at the same table. It's like we're all in this together, and the minute, microscopic, almost indiscernible differences between my version of concupiscence and imperfection and yours, or the worst criminal, in relationship to the infinite perfection of God, is not worth squabbling over. and it's like, so people are wounded and flawed, yes, and as am I. And so let's figure this thing out together.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about borderline personality dynamics. And I'm just really curious what you think, in your experience, what your experience has been. What do Catholics misunderstand about borderline personalities? What do they not get? And just kind of flesh that out for us a little bit. What kind of misconceptions are out there in the Catholic world?
Sure. Well, I think, I mean, I think you did a wonderful job in the last episode in explaining the sort of fundamentals from a secular perspective. And in the way that our theoretical orientation is very much in the line of like a psychodynamic approach. So, and I think you had mentioned McWilliams, and we use Tiber and Benjamin, and so we look at these needs that are expressed through these different disorders, and what we see there is at the heart of it is this intense need for not being abandoned, for being nurtured, for being protected. So a person develops personality patterns, behavioral patterns, to sort of manipulate that out of people. And then when they start to get it, then there's intense terror that it's going to be removed or rejected or abandoned. And so there's this constant push and pull. But I think, and so kind of going off of that foundation, we can realize that if you're the one in that situation, if you're with somebody, in relationship with somebody that is acting that way, it feels violent. And it can be emotionally or even physically violent. And I think the first misperception by Catholics, non-Catholics alike, is that this is, somebody's out to get you. Somebody is taking it out on you. So it's about you. And, I think obviously all this would be pretty consistent with parts work and IFS as well. But, to really take that step back and the first fundamental sort of awareness to clear up some misconception is that nothing this person is doing is about you. It's not about you personally. It's not about what you did or didn't do at the level of personhood, of self, of your real identity, your real intention. And then second of all, to see that as a real restriction of freedom. The person does not have freedom operating out of personality disorder. And that's a general principle. When we talk about a Catholic anthropology, there's a need for human freedom. We talk about self-determination, and this is John Paul II's anthropology that grounds all the work that we do. He talked about bringing out the full awareness of our action, what we do, what we say, even what we think or how we feel, and having full cognitive awareness, full conscious awareness of how we're acting so that we can make choices, that it's out of choice that we are acting with freedom, that we can then engage self-determination to become the saints that we're created to become. And there are so many factors that limit the freedom that we have. And, addiction is an obvious example. We could talk about that pretty easily. And there will be layers and levels of limitations upon human freedom. And so I think it's just really helpful to at least create a paradigm where that language is okay. And we can separate from the behavior, the words, the actions are hurtful, maybe even abusive, are certainly unacceptable. We need to create space and not be subject and victimized by certain things like that, without personalizing it, either against yourself or thinking about the other person as being the sort of fully free originator of these kinds of behaviors.
Because so much of this is happening from the past. Would you agree? Like, so much of this, of what they're reacting to,
Absolutely,
is stuck 10, 20, maybe 40 years ago.
Absolutely. So many of those parts reacting with their own noteworthy and respectable and understandable patterns of protection. Really, and so that's what's so disorienting being with somebody in relationship. It's like, I'm not hurting you this way. I am not a threat to you. I've committed my life to you. I'm here for you. I've proven my loyalty to you over and over and over again. And yet you're still acting like I'm going to leave you tomorrow, because it's not about you. And it's that protector part that's showing up to still be on guard and creating behaviors that are to protect against being left, because to that part and to that person in that history really was left, was abandoned on some level, and was neglected. And so, and just to throw in there too, with the Catholic piece of it as well, we always have the Catholic,
right.
The other parts, which is like, well, this person needs to pray more, this person needs to be more virtuous, this person should go to confession. And of course, all of those things may be true, but those are definitely not going to be the answer to the deepest wounds of somebody suffering with borderline type behaviors.
Yeah, there's this temptation that we can have in the Catholic world, that we can spiritualize these things, that we can spiritually bypass these things. And really what we're called to, especially for something that's happening in the natural realm, we need natural means. And that doesn't mean that we ignore the spiritual, not at all, but we really have this mission, you and I, to bring in this human formation stuff, because the disruption here is in the human formation realm, and that can have spiritual consequences, and it does, but we want to make sure that we don't interpret that as being primarily a spiritual problem.
Yes, exactly.
So
yeah, that's the real work of integration. It's really, sometimes I break open integration as being, I think of us as missionaries of the incarnation. And because so much of the Catholic and Christian spirituality space is almost, it's like the incarnation is too much to handle.
Too
Like God
gritty, too
became,
real,
it's too much.
too bodily, too embodied, and
Like
too
this stuff that
messy.
we're so disgusted with. Like God did not become this.
Right.
And then the sort of derivatives of that become like, okay, so to be spiritual, we have to leave behind this stuff.
Right.
And then that then includes the brain and the hormones and the chemicals and family dynamics and genetics, and
To rise above it all, right? To
we have
rise
to
above it all. Yeah.
shed these dirty bodysuits and ascend into heaven.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. There's a temptation that way. There's a temptation that way. So I want to jump to the end in a sense. And if there was one or two lines, one or two thoughts that you would say, write this down. This is the takeaway that I really want you to go home with. This is, if there's one thing you remember from this podcast episode, this is it. This line. What would those be, Dr. Gray?
Oh boy.
Distill it all down for us.
I feel like I'm in like a copywriting meeting right now. It's like
yeah, I know. It's a tough job. And you know what? If you have to pass, you pass. But
no.
I just want you to struggle with it a little bit here.
Well,
So
you did promise there's going to be some editing afterwards, so you can polish this up and make it sound good, right?
That's right. I will.
Okay, couple lines that I think are really important. I think people with borderline personality disorder are children of God looking for love.
Mhm.
And people with borderline personality disorder are children of God who deserve love. And so I think if we break those two things open, we can see that number one, it helps us understand what's going on and create that emotional space. Because I'm imagining that either a person is really interested in this topic because they're most likely they're dealing with somebody else in their life who has either been diagnosed or they think should be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Or maybe it's a person who has been diagnosed with it or thinks or suspects about themselves that maybe they match up with some of the symptoms they can Google and get from WebMD. So what we want to really break that open is to say, this is one flavor of a constellation of symptoms or patterns or behaviors that, as you've said already, don't even fit into a neat box. And it all speaks the same story, that we are made for love, to be loved, and to love, and that we are seeking desperately for that. And when we are wounded in relationships, and the opposite of love is what has been provided to us and has formed us, we will have necessary God-given consequences to that. God built us to have defense mechanisms. God built us to develop personality patterns. He didn't want the sin or the imperfection or the concupiscence in the first place, but he built us to have a survival instinct, which is connected to our defense mechanisms.
Mm.
When you get burned, your skin throbs. When you have a wound, you develop a callus or a scab. That's because we are made with a core for integrity, for a principle of life with a survival instinct. So we have to see each other in that light. And then the second part is also really important, and I think is also probably the most difficult for people who are in relationship with somebody with BPD or borderline-like patterns, is that these people deserve love. Now, that sounds foofy and great and warm and fuzzy, but when it comes to borderline patterns of behavior, typically the people in relationship have a lot of work to do to learn how to love more. And that can be very challenging because love is not just giving in. Love is not just avoiding conflict. Love is not just having peace in all relationships. Sometimes, and in these cases, most of the time, real love is firm boundaries. And that can be incredibly difficult. And that can mean that somebody has to evaluate why they're in this relationship, what they need, what they're trying to get out of it, what they're going to have to sacrifice, what they are going to have to mourn the loss of and grieve not having. For what? For love, to actually love. So I'm going to, I think they both things need to be unpacked a little bit, but again, trying to summarize in a sentence that we can look at people suffering in these ways as being children who deserve, who are longing for love and who deserve to be loved.
Well, I so like how you're circling back around and centering this on love, right? The two great commandments in our faith, to love God, to love our neighbor as ourselves. And you also brought up that love that sometimes gets neglected. There's three loves in those two commandments. And that is to, as you're trying to love someone in your life that has borderline dynamics, you don't neglect to love yourself, right? So there's a way that these loves can all be in harmony, even though it can be really hard, especially initially, to figure out what that looks like. There's a way that these loves can be in harmony, and they might not look like what you expect it to look like at first blush, so.
Amen. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So I want to go ahead and just open this up. I'm curious if folks are ready to start asking questions. We definitely want to hear your voices. We want to know where you're coming from with regard to this whole question of borderline personality dynamics. So we've got one in the chat that says, so Dr. Greg, how do you stay in relationship with someone who is threatening to harm themselves, harm you, or harm other family members? Someone who refuses help with mental health issues. All we could figure out was to block this person's access to us. What other options are there?
How to stay in a relationship with someone who's threatening to harm themselves. Well, there's a number of levels there. There's a number of different problems. I think the baseline, first of all, really important thing for everybody to understand is that, and this is actually sometimes surprising for people to learn, that even trained psychologists are not trained to be responsible for stopping somebody from harming themselves.
Yes.
And what we're trained in is how to not bear the burden of holding that responsibility, even implicitly. And that takes training, because it takes practice to sometimes say, you know what, this is not my responsibility. It's not my problem. And so just as a fundamental principle, you can't be in relationship with anybody, healthy or unhealthy, where you are holding that responsibility like it's your job to stop somebody from harming themselves. If you are ever having any concern that somebody is going to hurt themselves or you or somebody else, you call 911. There are people who are trained to bear the burden of that responsibility. And, of course, we can get into nuance in terms of actually breaking that open a little bit more. But in general, if it's ever a question and you haven't been trained in knowing the nuance, that's what 911 is for. So there's no relational dynamic in which it's appropriate to think that the way that you're in relationship with this person is somehow lessening their threat to harm themselves, or somebody else or you. And so with borderline patterns, it is often the case that they will use very extreme statements and expressions to garner attention or pity or empathy or compassion, or fear. And so it's important to learn how to not play that game, how to not step into that space as if you're going to be moved by their statements. And so when it means somebody says, if you don't call me back, I'm going to kill myself, you call 911. And then maybe you let them know help is on the way, or you maybe navigate that specifically. So again, we're talking in very hypothetical generalizations here.
Right.
I'm not giving any specific clinical advice, but it's that kind of thing to change the way you're thinking, being in relationship with people in those situations. And then, and if the person refuses to get help, that's another very wide spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that's going to be tough to say there's a one size fits all kind of answer there. And it also depends on the kind of relationship.
Right.
If you're vowed to somebody in marriage who's suffering in these ways, that's a very different situation than if you started dating somebody and it's been 2 weeks and you see borderline tendencies. Your options are probably very different in that situation.
Right. Right.
So yeah, there's a lot of variability within that as well.
So yeah, so I'm just sort of hearing here to remember too that there's some kind of attempt to seek a good, even though that attempt might be really disordered, even though that attempt might be maladaptive, to try to seek some sort of good. And so one thing that you can also do is sort of try to think or read between the lines, if you know the person, to think about like what might be the need, the attachment need or the integrity need that this extreme threat or this behavior or this pattern of speech is representing. But again, if you have to assess where you are with it. It's really easy to get destabilized. And so you do want to assess kind of what's your capacity to respond effectively to the person at that time. So sometimes the best possible thing you can do, in the spirit of sort of primum non nocere, first do no harm, is to withdraw and to kind of really take care of where you are so that you don't exacerbate the situation any worse than it has to be. We have to be humble about what our capacities really are.
Yeah, and then you get a support system. You need your own relationships where you can feel supported in that and creating and maintaining that space. People who know what kind of support you need, not just any friend that you might have that can commiserate, but somebody who can give you real solid direction on creating some space. And that could be professional, it could be, it could be spiritual, it could be friendship. But we need each other. We need relationships, and usually these kinds of relationships are distressing at the deepest core levels, and so we need to counterbalance that as well.
Well, I see a hand up from Marianne. Come join us, Marianne. Let's hear what you got on your mind.
Really resonated, and this is a family member that has this. With what Dr. Bottaro said about there's real terror that one will be abandoned, and that so much of this is a reaction from the past, the patterns of protection. We see this, but the common themes, and I don't know if this is common to borderline, is anxiety and anger. Just these seems to be coping mechanisms. Is that pretty consistent, or is that maybe just this particular individual? But it seems to be the anger seems to be a way of trying to manipulate or trying to take charge of the situation. It just seems like if some people on a scale of 1 to 10 are calm at 2 or 3, this person seems to always live, when they're calm at 7, and they're always bumping up against 10. So I'm just wondering if anxiety and anger are a big part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole constellation is sort of grounded on some deep anxiety. There's this constant fear of abandonment, and even if the person is sort of on the surface dealing with their distress in that moment with an anger part and a protector in that form, it's going to be grounded on an anxiety that's underlying everything else, as opposed to like a narcissism where there's going to be, a lot less of that sort of pervasive anxiety, and you might not see it as much, but the person with anger that's coming through with borderline is the anger is not going to be as well founded. In other words, it's going to be a lot less stable, and can often dissipate just as quickly as it emerges. And you might see people switching between anger and anxiety, or anger and fear, or anger and a kind of dependency and a please don't leave me, based on subtle nuances of reactions of being in relationship with that person. If they pick up on, it's like they might drill you with some anger over and over and over again. And as long as they're backing you into the corner, that might actually increase, but or sustain. But then as soon as they see that, you've had enough, and you have an internal shift, and you might be ready to walk away, that could dissipate in a second, that anger, and turn into fear and anxiety or something else. So you will see those patterns coexist a lot more. And I think disorder or disorganized or chaotic is often a term used to accompany those kinds of symptoms.
Yeah, thank you for that, Marianne. Nora, I've got a hand up for you. What would you like to ask?
Yeah, hi. Really grateful to be on this with you guys. So this is a bit of a personal question as someone who simply resonates with some of the characteristics of BPD, just in general. Google, take that with a grain of salt. But this tendency of, I think, self-hatred I heard mentioned, my question is this: if there's this heavy strain of perhaps self-hatred that so much of my perhaps Catholic standard bearer just calls that a sin in a very spiritual sense, but then in the natural sense, I'm wondering, in like the natural realm, if there's like this disorder that can create that, like in both those things, what is the role of concupiscence and wound that can sort of distort that sense of self? I don't know if I'm making sense. And perhaps that can wounds make like the pull of concupiscence stronger, or can wounds create a natural disorder that isn't necessarily even sin? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. It's a very complex, sophisticated question because you're bringing in a number of different elements here that are. It's really good to parse all of these things out.
Okay.
I think it's there's all different kinds of sin that we can talk about, and in terms of active, again, intentional sin, which requires freedom. Especially if we're talking about things that would be a mortal sin, but then we could talk about sort of lesser venial sin, and then we could talk about just the effect of sin in the world in a very generic sense. Now, the woundedness that accompanies the response and reaction to being wounded is not a sin. So developing an identity as a psychological reaction to being wounded by somebody else's sin or somebody else's wounds, and it's, it could be either or. We're not saying it's one or the other, but it could be either or. But the reaction to either is not a sin. Ultimately, this all goes back to sin because it all goes back to the garden.
Yeah.
And the identity that you're talking about is the identity of being a daughter of God or a son of God, made in his image, as Adam and Eve were. And the original lie, the original wound, is the devil, the serpent lying to Eve to plant a seed of doubt in her mind that the Father does not love her infinitely, and that the Father is maybe out for his own design, that the Father doesn't want her to have the knowledge that he has. And so that's why he set up the rule about the fruit in the garden. And actually, there's a different way. If you don't do it the Father's way, and you're going to be protecting yourself from his not loving you. That's the original sin, and that's the original lie, and that's the original wound. And that, as I said earlier, every one of us is affected by that wound, and it takes a lot of different shapes and sizes and flavors and colors. But that's ultimately it. And the solution is to come back to the core truth of our identity and our reality, that we are loved into existence and that we are sons and daughters of the Father who is infinitely loving us. So that the self-hatred is not, again, I'm not your spiritual director. I'm not a priest. I'm not a theologian. But as a psychological wound, when I see people develop a constellation, a sort of a system of belief, a narrative about themselves as being unworthy and lowly, and I see so much of that being a reaction to the way that things have transpired in their life, it is not a sin. It's a wound. And it needs the healing grace of God. It needs the loving salve of the Father to be poured into it, to be embraced. And that's where we come back to Therese, to climb up into that Father's lap and let him just hug you and love you, and let him teach you in that love who you actually are, because you're his daughter. So it's a bit different than I think a lot of times people have from, again, that spiritual bypassing kind of perspective. We'd rather have these easy categories that if I have this problem, in a sense, it'd be a lot nicer if it was a sin. We could just go confess and be done with it. Like, we get used to that. It's like, that's great if we can have a sin to just go confess and then it's gone. Unfortunately, wounds are not like that, when there's so many other layers of psychological complexity and reaction to the way we've been mistreated and misloved in our lives.
And I would add too that things can be disordered without being sinful. And it's a really important distinction. So if a person is born without arms, like a thalidomide baby, that's disordered. The body wasn't supposed to be that way, but that wasn't a result of the infant's sin, right? So a lot of times you can have impulses, desires, you can have attitudes, you can have beliefs that are disordered, but not sinful. They wouldn't become sinful until you embrace them or you endorse them internally, you give them sanction, you give them life, you nurture them within you. If they come up spontaneously as a sort of first moral act, they don't carry that spontaneous sort of or if they're unwanted, they don't carry the weight of sin because they're not willed, right? So one of the things that I know you do, Dr. Greg, a lot, this is part of the whole mindfulness thing, it's just seeing if we can suspend judgment about these things until we can understand them more deeply. Seeing if we can take a step back. Let's take a look at some of the of what's going on inside in a way that allows things that are real to exist in our own minds, to just accept that reality.
And yes, gosh, so much of that is so good. And it's and I don't want to, I know you're going to talk a lot more about parts work in subsequent episodes, but it's also a fundamental inviting of compassion into yourself, and a fundamental disposition to say, you know what? Okay, part of me has a story that I deserve self-hatred. I'm not worth being loved. And if you can have that awareness as you're taking that step back and you're seeing that in yourself, you're opening space to then love that part of you. So that part is not offering compassion, but that part doesn't need to yet, because you can offer compassion to that part. It's like, okay, part of me hates me. Well, I wonder if there might not be a way that would be understandable to that part. Like if we started with an assumption of goodness, with compassion, and you approach that part and said, why am I not worthy of being loved? Instead of just like, oh, that's a sin, I'm not supposed to think that way, I have to stop saying that, I have to stop doing that. And we're just repressing and kicking out and burying those parts of us. That's not actually loving ourselves. So we create that space, and then we invite love and compassion into it. And then you actually talk to that part and you realize, like, actually all of you is lovable. Even that part that is saying that you're not lovable. And it's like you have a sense of self that's bigger than that part, and more mature and more loving and compassion. You sort of tap it on the head. It's like, yes, of course, I know I'm not lovable, but why? Why? Let's just talk about that for a minute. Why would you think that I'm not lovable? What would happen if I was lovable? But let me understand you and what you're thinking and why you're saying this and why you want me to cut myself or, do all these things that let's just talk about it. and you're bringing love to the part, and then things start to change.
You're really talking about being with yourself,
Yeah.
just being with yourself with some gentleness, with some compassion. And I just think that's so powerful. And yeah, it's just music to my ears to hear you talking part stuff too, Dr. Greg.
I can't help myself.
Thank you both. That was awesome.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. Bridget, I see a hand from you.
Thank you, Dr. Peter. I have a question. How would a Catholic parent with a spouse having BPD characteristics navigate teaching or picking up the pieces with young children who witness severe emotional dysregulation as a somewhat common experience without undermining the spouse or triangulating?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you're getting this one, Dr. Greg.
I was going to ask if you wanted to take one of these.
This is how I treat my guests, right?
Thank you so much for having me on tonight. Oh my goodness.
Sorry. You can
No.
it.
This
it's okay.
this is no, and I can help out too. This is really, really good. This is really important, because one of the concerns that parents have in these situations is, what about the children, right? And that's where a lot of fear can come up. And I'm going to say one thing before I turn this over to Dr. Greg, and that is, before time began, before the world was created, God knew exactly the situation that every husband would be in with his wife, and every wife would be in with her husband and their children. And there was a plan for the difficulties that are going on in that household right now. That it's not something that's just sort of happening randomly outside of his awareness. Oftentimes we can kind of take a deistic type of approach to these sorts of things, to think, okay, what good might be coming from this? How can this be a call? God has a plan for each of the children. He loves them more than any human father, human mother can love their children, because they're his children, right? So I just want to frame it in terms of that first, so that we're not left out here twisting in the wind, abandoned by God, left to our own devices in an impossible situation. So I just wanted to frame it that way before I handed it to you, Dr. Greg. So
yes, thank you. No, I think that's a great setup. And Bridget, I want to apologize. My making light of the question was one part of me trying to make a point of how deep and difficult this experience really is. And this is a common type of conflict. In many different forms, not just in dealing with BPD or these patterns, but I think it's helpful to, and Dr. Peter and I have not discussed this particular issue before, so I don't know that, it's okay also between colleagues to maybe have different approaches.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm not saying that I think we will, but just to say that this is such a really good question, and it may actually bring up differences that we could talk about in different angles. But I think that our culture, our Catholic culture, has been very influenced by a couple of misunderstandings about marriage and the relationship between men and women, and the role of the submission of spouses, and especially between men and women, and the disparity in the roles of man and woman. That I think that, just to lay this out there as a frame, in many ways, we're in need of deep healing and sort of growing in our understanding. I think that it's really important that in Catholic marriage, we are submitting ourselves first to God. And the context of our submission is if we're married, is the vow of marriage. And that therefore the spouse is the recipient of our gift of self as a proxy or as a context for how we are actually making the gift of self to God. We are giving ourselves entirely over to God through our spouse. So there cannot be a contradiction in which we are serving our spouse, submitting ourselves, in which we are not submitting ourselves to truth and love and goodness as the transcendental qualities of God. And again, that may be a little bit different than, especially some Protestant understanding that, and I think some of that has seeped into our church, of this sort of very separated, superficial understanding of marriage as a vocation to holiness. It's almost disintegrated from the relationship to truth itself, himself, and love himself. So in the psychological areas, it's a little bit more difficult to parse that out. But let me start off with an example of somebody that I know in the realm of physical illness. And I know of a couple in which they got married, and early on in the marriage, the wife ended up having a thought disorder emerge, and she had a psychosis that took over. And for the next 40, 50 years of this couple and family's life, working around that, managing that, became the sole purpose and focus of their family mission. And through the advent of great medication and wonderful treatment and all sorts of things, after a couple of decades, her symptoms started to lessen, and then they had a beautiful family life and a beautiful sort of witness to the world. There are many times when Dad had to say, no, the aliens are not coming to abduct us. And that's actually what she was packing all the kids up to get in the van and take off across the country. And the husband had to stop, had to take, the bags out of the car, had to stop them from driving out across the country. She was terrified. Legitimately, that was the world she lived in. And he had to tell the kids, your mom is not well. Your mom does not see the truth and what's real and no, kids, we don't have to be afraid of aliens, and everything is going to be okay. We're going to get through this together. At the end of life, after a couple decades, this man developed Parkinson's disease, severely debilitating Parkinson's. And at the end of their marriage, before he died, the last, I think, probably decade, was her serving him and taking care of him and taking care of the kids. And then the kids were afraid of losing their dad, and the mom had to say, everything's going to be okay. And, this is not the end. And even though this is what it looks like, and this is how Dad is doing, we believe in life everlasting. And she was the one to bring the family back to truth. So I love this story for a couple of reasons. It shows a deeper truth about marriage. It shows a deeper orientation to a higher calling to love and beauty and goodness and truth. And it's easier to see in a physical ailment, and obviously schizophrenia is a psychological ailment, but it's more easy to conceptualize that as a physiological brain neurological kind of experience. And then obviously Parkinson's. I think we can extrapolate from that a number of points that are true for emotional dysregulation, and especially for something that's a personality disorder, that the ultimate role is to serve truth and love. And sometimes loving means setting hard boundaries. Sometimes loving means grieving the loss of what you signed up for in marriage and what you want in return, what you hoped for in return, what you would love to get in return. And it means maybe, marrying somebody who ends up, I know another couple that on the wedding or on the honeymoon, the husband had a surfing accident and was a paraplegic for the rest of his life. And that's not what they signed up for, but praise God, hopefully it got them to heaven. So there's different ways to look at the situation. And it means sometimes putting yourself in the middle and jumping into the breach and holding that space to teach your children what love really looks like. And again, that can have a lot of variations and spectrum, and I'm, not giving any specific, direction here, but it means discerning apart from the emotional reaction of one's spouse, what the school of love is going to be built on. Taking into context the reaction and emotional disposition of one's spouse, but not as the form of the curriculum. Does that make sense? Okay.
And a lot of this is detailed in Castis Conubis on human marriage. Pope Pius XI, 1930. Excellent document. That's a document I go back to a lot. There's a lot of depth and richness in Castis Conubis on human marriage.
That's a good reference. And also, just to be very clear, when I say that in Catholic culture or seeped into our Catholic, I don't mean magisterially.
Right,
in any way. And in fact, the magisterium, as you've pointed out, is very clear on what our true purpose and vocation is.
Right.
But sometimes the cultural manifestation of our faith can take different turns.
Well, a lot of times we assume we know when we haven't read. We haven't read the catechism. We haven't read, some of the church documents. Some people are really astonished to find that what they thought was there is not really what the texts say. It's not really what the church is teaching. So, Isabella.
Somebody brought to my awareness that there are certain characteristics and behaviors associated with BPD that they see in me. And so for me, this was Friday. So for me, these past couple of days, it's been trying to discern, okay, how do I approach true authentic healing so that, these things aren't continuing to wound people in my current relationships. So how do I approach that healing on an integrated level, not falling into the trap of okay, I want to get a formal diagnosis and then maybe using that to justify my actions, or going the other route and over spiritualizing it and saying, all right, I just need to pray it away, go to confession, some of those things we mentioned earlier. How do I discern that route without falling into either extreme?
I think that's a great question. And it's number one, I mean, it's a really humble, beautiful question in itself, and so there's lots of different things you can do with that openness. Number one, and I'm not saying pray it away, but pray for discernment and direction. A lot of times we forget that our greatest aid is prayer. And I'm not saying pray to be healed of BPD. I'm not saying pray that you don't have these problems anymore. It's but just pray as step one of any discernment process about anything. So then you're opening yourself up to the inspiration and grace of the Holy Spirit, that maybe the Holy Spirit says, maybe get diagnosed, have an assessment if it's that level. Or maybe, maybe the Holy Spirit inspires you to say, check in with different people or check in with a professional. I would also say that in general, the treatments for BPD, very specifically and clinically speaking, are really healthy for just about everybody. So, and we have a certification program, and we have all of our students go through. In fact, we have a couple of our students here right now. I'm really happy to see you guys. The second half, in teaching the psychology, we do a deep dive into these personality disorders, and a whole quarter, the assignments for the reflections are to give voice to the parts in us that are the same as the personality disorders that we're studying. So in other words, if we ever hope to be able to accompany anybody who is having some of these experiences, we have to see them in ourselves. And the ways that we approach our own borderline parts, whether we're, fully blended with them or not, we all have these parts. And the way that we approach them is going to be the same. So, I think Dr. Peter mentioned in the prior episode, DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, and there's different modules of DBT. And if you start to break open what DBT looks like, it's actually, I need to practice a lot more of this in my own life. And if I thought about some of these things before I get into a tense conversation with my wife, I bet that conversation will go a lot better. And some of that is as easy as mindfulness. Obviously, we already know a lot about that. So, figuring out how to get space between you and your feelings, figuring out how to sort of feel in your body where you're feeling certain things, and then you can sort of depersonalize from certain thoughts and feelings that you're having, not identify with everything so deeply. And, some of those internal experiences that go along with those kinds of traits, you can work on whether or not you have a diagnosable disorder. And, I would say, if I was walking with you over some time, our approach typically would be like, let's try that. See how much traction you get. Are there certain fights in your life that keep happening, certain distressful moments that you keep experiencing, certain things you're really afraid of? Well, put into practice some of those things and see what happens after trying it out for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks. And maybe keep a little journal and mark where those experiences are and where they go. And then maybe see, like, okay, like maybe this is budging, maybe this is not budging. But you get to know a little bit more about what's going on. So it can be a helpful sort of path to have pointed out for you, that you can take that humility into that next step of even just kind of internalizing it for yourself.
Thank you so much.
And I would just add, it helps to be able to see yourself through the eyes of someone who's attuned to you and who loves you. And I don't mean necessarily loves you in terms of a romantic or family sense, but that idea of seeing myself through the eyes of another can really help us with perspective when we're struggling to understand what's real or what's going on inside. And I too was very struck just by the humility and the beauty of the question, So I'm super excited for you that you can ask this and there can be an openness to hearing answers. Because if you seek, Isabella, you'll find. You'll get what you need to know.
Thank you so much to both of you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Annabelle.
Thank you for taking my questions, Dr. Peter and Dr. Greg. I have a 23-year-old son who got married to a woman that I suspect she has patterns of narcissistic BPD. And so I know there's a lot of wounds there, but 2 to 3 months in the marriage, my son started a cut-off behavior, which he never did in the past. Cut off in terms of not responding to any calls or texts. And then later on, he would reach out to us. He said he was in turmoil. I've noticed that he had not taken care of himself physically and emotionally. I've seen a stark change in my son. And they have a 1-year-old daughter, and she had controlled everything to the point where we don't even pictures on the phone or a FaceTime. She doesn't allow that for our granddaughter. So there's a lot of control. And my son showed up. She had texted and asked for space. And we were a little confused with the space she requested because we don't get to go to their home unless we have an appointment. We weren't allowed to meet up for a family gathering. We didn't see them last Christmas, but then in 2 months after Christmas, she's asking for space. So I was confused, like, what space is she asking when we don't go see them? And we were limited in terms of what we can see with the granddaughter. And then she started cutting off my son and isolated him. But he came about 4 months ago. He came to our house, and he wasn't supposed to be not allowed to come inside our home. And she would keep calling him. And my son started crying and apologized to us. And so 2 weeks ago, my husband and I celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary. So I invited them. I sent them an invite. And I went all kinds of ways to reach out since they're not responding by phone or text. But finally, she replied, and she said, "No, we're not attending the event." And then she went on and threatened me that if you continue to reach out, that they will go farther and further away. And so I ignored it because I've already sensed that there is some borderline personality disorder. So my question is, how do I help my son? Because I don't think he is aware that he is in a relationship there's no freedom. Really, I feel like there's an emotional abuse, but being them very young, I say young, he's 23, and and my daughter-in-law is 24. I know they're learning to be married, but then at the same time, I'm seeing a lot of patterns of the BPD.
I would wonder what does your son feel about the dynamic?
When he came and talked to us, he just said she's very stubborn. He said he's in turmoil. He's not comfortable that we don't see him, we don't talk to him, and we don't get to see his daughter. But then at the same time, I kind of accounted like he's trying to be accommodating to her control and being so understanding, but I don't think he's happy about it. But he made a comment one time, I'm not strong enough. And I feel so sorry for my son that he can't stand up and he doesn't have any autonomy to make a decision. So for example, I said, why can't we have FaceTime so I can see the baby crawl or move? And he said, if it was just me, I would do FaceTime, but she doesn't allow it.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, again, it's not something we could give any specific counsel to, especially you're bringing up family systems issues.
Mhm.
And I know Dr. Jerry is going to be talking about family systems. Not to push off another hard question onto somebody else. I guess Dr. Peter and I can both.
But you're absolutely right.
We'll collude in pushing it off on Dr. Jerry.
And he did that. He came in and talked about narcissistic dynamics in families. He's going to do the same thing for us in December, on December 13th. We're going to have a special one that's focused really on family issues. But one thing I noted in what you were saying is that it sounds like your son loves you still. Like that hasn't gone away.
Yes.
I think we need to hold on to that.
Mhm.
And to remember that these situations tend not to be stable. We sometimes can worry that this is going to be the way it is for 10, 20, 30 years. And rarely does it have a course that's that simple.
Mhm.
So I would go back to what you were saying before, Dr. Greg. What does it mean for you to love your son given these circumstances? What does it mean to love your daughter-in-law given these circumstances? And so I'm just curious if you have any more thoughts about that, Dr. Greg.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking already just about St. Monica. Regardless of the family systems, you're looking at what you can do, what's in your heart, what's your direction, what's your path to sainthood in this context, in these circumstances. And sometimes it means taking that approach of St. Monica and just pouring yourself out in prayer and serving the reality of the situation. And so again, all these little details, the nuances of the family systems are going to be different for everybody. And so, every once in a while, I can imagine, and I don't know, but St. Monica must have made side comments to Augustine when he was living with a woman in his house having illegitimate children. I mean, maybe there's a place for that. Maybe there's not. Maybe it's, you take some time and you take a real step back. Maybe it's you discern that you make a statement or you make another request. The underlying principle is always going to be to lay down your life in love, to sacrifice your own needs and desires. And especially as a grandparent, when it's so painful, you have so many hopes and dreams. You've raised this child. You've thought about the future. You've had so many fantasies about the future, so many hopes for his marriage, for his life, for your grandchildren. And it just challenges the heck out of every one of those things. But that's what God does. He challenges our expectations and he casts us out. He tells us to cast out into the deep, and he tells us to trust him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the point. It's like if the circumstances weren't dire, then it wouldn't require heroic trust. So we can't be thrown off by how dire it seems. And the more that you just reorient yourself back to the Father and to know that he's loving you as a daughter, then you can love your son as a mother who's actually laying down her life, continuing to lay down her life as you have your whole life. And in this case, in this context, that means dealing with that pain and grieving the loss of not seeing your grandchild's first steps, or opening the Christmas presents this year. And that's a dagger in the heart. I know that, but it's also that's the path. And there is a path, and there is one to walk, and God will give you the grace to sustain you by choosing a path of love.
Yes, thank you. I do. I recognize that this is what's going to help me with my holiness and my sanctity.
Mm-hmm. There's a gift
Amen.
in here. There's a gift in
Yeah.
here. Yeah.
And there's a purpose for what
Yeah.
God is
Yeah.
allowing to happen. Thank you.
Amen. You're welcome.
Well, Dr. Gray, I'd like to squeeze one more question in if we can.
Sure.
And before we sort of bring it to a close. Madeline.
Thanks, Dr. Peter. This isn't a question so much as a comment, because you said something, one of you, I can't remember who, said in response to maybe Isabella's beautiful question, to be seen through the eyes of a loving other. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So because I'm also somebody who has borderline tendencies, at least. And Dr. Greg, I was one of the first people in the mentorship program. And that was so key for me, that relationship. It changed my life. And now, now I'm in RCC. And as I come to understand sort of what goes on with me, I found that I'm finding that because I have a safe place, I know that Dr. Peter is not going to tell me you shouldn't be feeling that. And I know that my therapist is not going to tell me that either. It gives me a place to a firm foundation that I can hold on to as this stuff kind of goes around, and it's making such a difference.
Wow. Thank you. That's so beautiful.
Well, and so
Madeline,
hopeful. So hopeful.
And you're it's what way to crown off the day with something that just made it all. I could do this for a whole nother day. I had a long day. And I was like, but this is why I do this. I thank you so much for sharing that. I'm so grateful for you showing up here, showing up now, expressing that and giving voice to that, because it is honestly, it gives me hope. It's your hope, and it's hopeful for everybody else struggling with these things. And it just praise God. That's all I can say is praise God. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Well, I want to create a little space here. I know Madeline brought up the mentorship program. I know you've got a lot of interesting things going on, Dr. Greg. So just give us a little sense of like what some of your offerings are and
Sure.
how they might be helpful. Yeah.
Well, we're basically doing two things now. We're offering help to people looking for help, and then we're offering training for people that want to help others. And so, our model that we've developed that Madeline was alluding to is called the mentorship program. And it's a long story I'll save everybody from right now. You can check out my podcast to hear more about it. But we basically, I really just hit a wall and wanted to dig a little bit deeper than what secular psychology was offering as far as a method of working with people. And so it just really I took a little break, a little sabbatical, and prayed and reflected and dug deep and just kind of imagined a different way to be able to walk with people on a daily basis, to really enter into where people are, to sort of leave behind the sort of confines and parameters of a secular, broken, relativistic system. And so we created this new model called mentorship. And so it's a little different. We're not meeting in real time once a week with people. We're meeting using a technology, an app. And essentially, we have an encrypted walkie-talkie, and you create a personal communication channel with a mentor. And then you get to talk every day back and forth, and really work on the things that you want to work on. So you can check more about that out at CatholicPsych.com. And then there's a link there that goes to another site called iddmentor.com. our model that we developed is called Integrated Daily Dialogic Mentorship, IDDM, and that's at iddmentor.com. And then out of that, we developed a program. We realized that so many people need help and are looking for it, and teachers in the school systems and diocesan systems and parish life and everywhere in between. Everybody has the same issue, same problem. They need more help. They need more therapists to refer to, Catholic therapists they can trust. And so I just realized too, there's no reason why we have to all wait around for somebody to get licensed by the state and then hope that they're Catholic and then hope that they have a space open and also hope that they're affordable or in your insurance network or whatever the case might be. And actually, a Catholic anthropology, and I know Dr. Malinowski will agree with me on this, the core fundamental part of a Catholic anthropology and psychology is relationship. And we're made out of relationship. We're formed in relationship in the family. We are wounded in relationship, and then we are healed in relationship. The relationships that we have in our accompaniment and walk with others is what this whole thing is about. So I was kind of struck by how we have all these people in ministry who are on the front lines in the world, developing real relationship with people who are suffering, and then needing to refer those people to us or to other professionals, probably having to wait a long time to see them, where then they would have to start off at step one, forming a relationship. So why not just give the people with the relationships some extra training and help them to do it in a more sort of intentional way and know how to hold boundaries and how to create space that's appropriate according to the appropriate role that person has in their life. So that's our certification program. We're taking the science that we use and the anthropology, the philosophy of John Paul II especially, and the spirituality of our faith, and bringing it all together, weaving it all together to teach people how to accompany others in a truly Catholic manner. All of that you can get at CatholicPsych.com. So that's a little bit of what we've been up to. We have the podcast. I'm sure I'm forgetting a whole bunch of stuff. I don't know.
I would definitely check out the On Being Human podcast. You're listening to a podcast now. You're engaged with the podcast now. Check out the Being Human podcast. Lots of great stuff there as well. And I just want to give you a little update on what's coming up for us. I want to thank you, Dr. Greg, for laying that out. Check out those resources. And next episode 127, will be all about understanding borderline dynamics through an internal family systems lens, grounded in a Catholic understanding of the human person. That will release on December 4th, 2023. Invite you into that one to understand more about how parts and systems, and especially how switching and blending contribute to borderline dynamics. In episode 125, the last one, we discussed the conventional approaches to BPD, psychodynamic approaches, dialectical behavioral therapy approaches, mentalization approaches by Anthony Bateman and Peter Fonagy, schema therapy by Jeffrey Young, and we did have a question about that in the chat. That is, I think, an effective approach because it deals with parts and systems, and then also some family therapy approaches. In the next one, we're going to be looking at internal family systems. And then Dr. Jerry Crete will be rejoining us in December. And Dr. Greg, we alluded to this. Wednesday evening, December 13th, 2023, from 7:30 to 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. He'll be with me for episode 128, titled Relating Well with Family Members with, quote, borderline, end quote, dynamics. We, again, very much similar format to this, 15 to 20-minute conversation. Then we'll open it up to questions. And we are very close to reopening the Resilient Catholics community to new members in the St. Francis Xavier cohort. That's what Madeline was referring to, the RCC, the Resilient Catholics community. That's very exciting. We have 3 overarching goals in the RCC. The first is to tolerate being loved by God, by others, by your innermost self. That means being known. That means being open to that vulnerability. Secondly, embracing your identity as a beloved little daughter or son of God. God, your father, Mary, your mother. your primary parents, right? We were talking about being made in the image and likeness of God. Dr. Greg brought that out so beautifully. And then the third, responding to God, your neighbor, and yourself by reflecting that love back. So join the interest list that we have for the RCC. Go to our RCC landing page, which is at soulsandhearts.com/RCC. Check that out, scroll it down, and then you'll get the updates about as we move forward. There's some gifts we're going to be giving just to folks that are on the interest list. And then mark your calendars for the evening of Friday, December 1st, 2023, from 8 o'clock p.m. to 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, when RCC lead navigator Marion Moreland and we will offer you a brief live presentation about the RCC, but we'll spend most of that time answering your questions. And we'll have some of our veteran RCC members there to answer those. So go to RCC landing page, which is soulsandhearts.com/RCC, and you can register for that Zoom meeting. It's a year-long program, 44 weeks, 90-minute meetings with a small group plus some individual companionship that is so important, daily connection. And so we just want to invite you to check that out. Remember, my conversation hours are every Tuesday and Thursday from 4:30 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. You can reach out to me, 317-567-9594. That's my cell number. I'm on that number every Tuesday, every Thursday, 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 317-567-9594. That's the best way to reach me in terms of being able to connect. And then a final thing, pray for us. Really, everything we do at Souls and Hearts is fueled by prayer. So please keep us in your prayers, and please keep Dr. Greg and the CatholicPsych Institute in your prayers as well, our companions in this human formation work in this corner of the vineyard.
Please and thank you.
Yeah. So good to have you, Dr. Greg, with us. It's just so blessed to have you in our midst, in our presence, sharing with us your wisdom.
Awesome. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here with you too. Such a blessing.
Our Lady, our Mother, untire of knots,
Pray for us.
Pray for us.
Saint John the Baptist,
Pray for us.
Pray for us.